Okay, thank you, Chris, for that introduction. And I'm going to give you an introduction to Jeremy Bentham. And then Chris will talk in more detail. Sorry, Tim will talk in more detail about our Transcribe Bentham program. Jeremy Bentham was born in 1748 and he died in 1832. And as you can see from this slide, he's still dead. What people know about Jeremy Bentham is that his stuffed body sits in University College London, and he invented a prison called the Panopticon. Those are the sort of the two most generally known facts about Bentham. Here in the slide, we have his auto-icon, his self-image. So when he died, he instructed that his skeleton be articulated, dressed in his clothes, and sat on a chair as though he's thinking. The operation, if that's the right word, was carried out by a man called Thomas Southwood Smith, who was Bentham's surgeon. And as you can see, the preservation of the head did not go well. We're not quite sure what they did, but they dried out the head and the skin has turned brown. The two piercing blue eyes are glass eyes, which Bentham carried around with him in the few years before he died, and had them made with a view to being placed in his auto-icon. I should say that first of all, the head is not usually on public display and was placed here between Bentham's feet, probably for the purposes of this photograph. And secondly, Bentham no longer sits in this box, which was located in the main building of my university, University College London in Bloomsbury. He now sits in a very modern, recently installed glass case in the new student centre. So he's still at UCL and still on public display. Southwood Smith, having tried to preserve the head, decided that it was too gruesome for display, and so they had a wax head made instead. And so they brought over from France a very famous anatomical modeler who made the head, the wax head, which you now see placed on the auto-icon. Bentham, as you can see, looks quite like Benjamin Franklin. And that was remarked to him in his own lifetime, and he seemed quite pleased about that. He did actually, not exactly meet Franklin, but he was in the same room with Franklin at one point in his life, just before the American Revolution. This auto-icon is essentially, I think, an attack on religion and the way in which religion monopolizes death. And it can be seen as a sort of a subversion of the regular, if you like, practices which we engage in with dead bodies. Bentham did not want to be buried because that would have meant giving money to a priest. He would have had to pay, or his estate would have had to pay, burial fees. But there was something else involved in the auto-icon as well. When Bentham died, he instructed that his body be dissected for the benefit of medical science. And so his body was taken over to near present-day Liverpool Street station in London, where there was a medical school, and the body was dissected for the benefit of medical students. But going back, this is young Jeremy when he was 12 years old, and he just entered the University of Oxford. It's reckoned that he was at that time the youngest person ever to be entered into either of the English universities. At the time, the only English universities were, of course, Oxford and Cambridge. So this portrait was painted in 1760, and that was the date of the accession of George III. And on the table next to him are some Latin verses that Bentham wrote to commemorate the accession of George III. There was a competition at the University of Oxford, and these verses came second. I suspect they didn't dare give first prize to a 12-year-old. And there's his violin. He was always a very talented musician as well. In later life, he rather enjoyed playing the organ. But his father recognised that he had a prodigy in his son Jeremy, and wanted him to become a lawyer and potentially rise to the top of the legal profession in England as Lord Chancellor. I suppose the irony is, in some respects, is that where Bentham ended up living, which was in Westminster, is now the site of the Ministry of Justice. But Bentham himself decided that he did not want to he did not want to practice the law, but he wanted to reform it. So he devoted himself to a career of writing, philosophizing, with the view of promoting law reform. When he was a young barrister, and he qualified as a barrister at the age of 21 on his 21st birthday, which was the earliest you could qualify as a barrister. In that year, 1769, he thought about what direction his career was going to take. And it seems that he was given a brief to recover a debt. And he worked out that if the client pursued the action, then it would cost him more in fees than he would recover in the debt. So even if he won the case, he would be out of pocket. And Bentham did that most unlawyer-like thing and advised the client not to pursue the case. And Bentham decided there's something wrong with the law if absurdities like that existed. And so really for the first 20 years of his writing life, through to about 1790, the time of the French Revolution, Bentham devoted himself to trying to write a code of laws, and in particular a penal code. So to reform criminal justice, get rid of the death penalty and the other corporal punishments that existed, get rid of offences where no one was harmed. And he's based his ideas on what was called the utilitarianism, or what's now called utilitarianism, the principle of utility. And this is the idea that all actions should be undertaken for the greatest happiness of the greatest number. So all his schemes were devoted towards that end. And he wrote widely. From the 1790s, I've mentioned the Panopticon Prison. This was the idea here was that you would have a governor in the centre of a building. As the building would be circular and the cells would be placed on the outside. And so the governor in the centre could look and see all the activity taking place in the cells, but the inmates would not be able to see the governor. So the inmates would think that, or would not know whether or not they were being watched, but assume they were being watched. And Bentham worked on the psychological principle that the more strictly we are watched, the better we behave. And so he thought this would be a means of ensuring good behaviour, while at the same time giving prisoners work to do, and therefore rehabilitating them so that they had skills and the potential for a proper job, rather than engaging in criminal activity when they were eventually released. The scheme was developed in great detail by Bentham. An Act of Parliament was passed authorising the building of the Panopticon, but it was never built. And Bentham thought he had been betrayed by ministers. And by 1809, he had become a political radical. In other words, he wanted democratic reform. and here's a portrait of the older Bentham from the 1820s, when Bentham had become a republican. He wanted to abolish the monarch and the House of Lords, so that the country would be ruled by an assembly voted in by the people every year. So there would be annual elections, and the authority would be in the legislature, the body that made the laws, and the executive, the government, would be subject to the legislature. And he developed a very elaborate scheme called, which he called his constitutional code, which dominated his life for the last 10 years, from about through the 1820s through to his death in 1832. He never gave up on law reform either. This is an example of Bentham's educational scheme, Chrestomathea, useful learning. He thought that this is really for a curriculum for middle-class teenagers, and he thought that the curriculum needed revising so that people weren't taught dead languages and theology as he'd been taught, which he regarded as useless subjects, and instead subjects that were useful for work, vocational subjects, as well as subjects which gave people interest during their leisure time should dominate the curriculum. And Bentham was a great organizer, as you can see from this table, and tried to work through his schemes logically and from first principles. And his educational schemes influenced the development of the University of London, of which UCL was the original institution, established in 1826. This is a portrait of Bentham. If those of you who know UCL can see the portico of the main building being built in the background, and Bentham is approving the plans, or while other people look on anxiously. This painting was painted in 1926, and it's a mythical scene. We don't think that, well, we until recently we didn't think Bentham had ever visited UCL, but in the mass of his manuscripts we've got a little bit of evidence that possibly he did go to go and have a look round on a sort of Founders Day. So maybe there's a bit of reality behind this painting, even though the painter at the time could not have known it. And UCL was established in 1826 by advanced thinkers, utilitarians, followers of Bentham, and also sort of progressive members of the Whig Party. And the response was made by the Church of England by establishing King's College. So here you have a contemporary cartoon from the late 1820s, which shows the representatives of University College on the left, Bentham at the top holding his books, and other worthies of the utilitarian and Whig hierarchy, with a weight of sense and science being easily outweighed by several fat bishops, and a weight of money and interest, and they're all going to be sliding off into hell. The how do we know that's Bentham in the white outfit? Well, it sort of vaguely looks like Bentham, but the extraordinary thing is that a few years ago I was called to a house in a London suburb up in Uxbridge, and there the the couple there had inherited a ring that Bentham gave on his death to his servant boy, a little picture of Bentham, and also what they claim was Bentham's dressing gown. And here it is. And we've no doubt that this is authentic. It's been looked at by textile experts, and apparently it would have been a woman's dress and was then reconstituted into a dressing gown. And given that it was with other artifacts which belonged to one of Bentham's servants, there's no doubt that this was Bentham's dressing gown. So maybe that is what's represented in this cartoon. One of the myths about Bentham is that he attends the meetings of College Council. University College Council, in other words, the governing body of UCL, that in his will he said that he had to be present at meetings of the College Council, and that this never happened until 1976, the 150th anniversary of the college, and he was wheeled into the meeting, and it's recorded in the minutes that they're 2/3 of the way down, Mr. Jeremy Bentham present but not voting, and so myth became something of a reality. He also attended another meeting quite recently when Malcolm Grant, our provost president, retired. But the important thing is not that UCL has Bentham's body, his corpse, but rather that we have his corpus, that is his manuscripts. And there are about altogether 80,000 or so pages of Bentham's manuscripts in the college library. And that's what we as the Bentham Project are doing. We're working with these manuscripts and with Bentham's printed texts to create the new edition of Bentham's writings. It's called the Collected Works of Jeremy Bentham, and the Bentham Project was established 60 years ago in 1959. We're probably not halfway through yet, but on the left there you see a manuscript. On the right is the way we reproduce it in our volumes. And Tim's going to talk about Transcribe Bentham, which is how a way we're trying to speed up the production of volumes in the collected works. We've published 34 so far, but I reckon that by the time we finish, there will be about 80 altogether. So there's one of the problems of doing things from home. The telephone goes off. But I've just about wrapped up. So I will now hand over to Tim, and hopefully manage somehow to stop sharing my screen. But I'll be happy to answer any questions later. So I've now stopped sharing. So thanks for listening.
Tim, can you hear us?
Here we go. Can you see my screen now?
It will take me a few moments to set that up. Yes, we can see your screen.
Good. Brilliant. Great. Let me get that out of the way. Right, thank you for having me along, and Chris for organising this, and for everyone else for coming and listening. Transcribe Bentham was launched in September 2010, and the fact that it's still going now...
Just to interrupt you there, Tim, you're currently getting your notes screen rather than your presentation.
Let me try this. Is that better?
No, it's gone back to notes.
So that was.
If you can minimise, get rid of the Skype window, then we're there.
Excellent. Sorry about that.
Thanks.
Brilliant. Yeah. Right. As I was saying, Transcribe Bentham was launched in 2010, September 2010, and that it's still going more than a decade later is, to my eyes, remarkable on two fronts, really. In the first instance, because digital humanities projects are often quite transitory, just because they're founded upon short-term grant funding like Transcribe Bentham was. And in the second instance, Transcribe Bentham was an experiment which we had no idea would work. So in the second half of the talk, what I'd like to give you is a quick sort of behind-the-scenes tour and run through why and how we established Transcribe Bentham, the project's progress to date, including how it's managed on a day-to-day basis, including how you assure that the transcripts produced by volunteers are of a sufficient enough quality, and if there's time, a brief word about our participation in two big European research projects working on handwritten text recognition. So when Transcribe Bentham was launched in 2010, scholarly crowdsourcing projects were few in number, and they typically required volunteers to carry out repetitive micro-tasks, either to generate research data or to improve publicly available resources. So volunteers recruited by the Galaxy Zoo project, which you can see here, classified the shape and colour of thousands of images of galaxies taken, I think, by the Hubble Space Telescope at that time, while the National Library of Australia asked its volunteers to correct OCR-produced transcripts of historic newspapers to improve the resource for other researchers. But there's been subsequently an explosion in crowdsourcing projects, such as What's on the Menu, Microprasts, but also based at UCL, and a whole host of projects supported by the Zooniverse ecosystem, such as Criminal Characters, based at the University of Sydney, the University of Technology in Sydney. But what all of these projects ask their volunteers to do is to transcribe manuscripts which are either fairly short or consist of a pro forma on which handwritten text has been added. And so they're fairly uniform, things like ship's logs and jail records, that kind of material. Some projects, like the Letters of 1916 to 1923 project at Maynooth University, crowdsource the transcription of correspondence, which can be more challenging, though those documents are still relatively short. When we launched Transcribe Bentham, we wanted to answer three questions. First, would volunteers be able to decipher and transcribe Bentham's manuscripts? Would the volunteers also be able to identify and encode in Text Encoding Initiative compliant XML the structural, spatial, organizational and compositional features of the manuscripts? And TEI is a sort of a de facto standard for the online presentation of texts. And finally, would the transcripts produced by volunteers be of sufficient quality for use in the production of the new volumes in the collected works of Jeremy Bentham, and for public display in a repository? I think even now, 10 years later, Transcribe Bentham really is uniquely demanding of its participants in that they're asked to carry out these two interconnected tasks, each of which is challenging enough in and of itself, that is, transcribing and encoding a page at a time, complex and 18th and 19th century handwritten manuscripts like the ones you're seeing here. As you can see, these are complicated to varying degrees of legibility by deletions, interlineations, marginalia, and plenty more besides, and no page is ever the same as the last. What all of these pages have in common is that they've all been transcribed to a very high standard by Transcribe Bentham volunteers, and one volunteer even transcribed this abomination, which I always stayed clear of because I value my eyesight too much to try that one. But the transcripts produced by volunteers serve two purposes. In the first instance, they're uploaded to UCL Library's digital Bentham Papers repository, alongside the respective images to create a searchable database of Bentham's papers. Meanwhile, we use the draft transcript as a starting point in preparing future volumes of the collected works. So volunteers are contributing to the production of humanities research rather than just consuming it. And moreover, since the manuscripts haven't been read and let alone understood, since Bentham wrote them, there's the potential of volunteers to make some quite significant discoveries about Bentham's life and thought. So how do we transcribe Bentham? At the heart of Transcribe Bentham is the Transcription Desk. It's a customised instance of MediaWiki developed by our colleagues at the University of London Computer Centre, which is now known as CoSector. Although the platform still does everything we need it to, it's fair to say that MediaWiki is looking a bit rough around the edges these days, and it can't support some of the more advanced refinements we might want to introduce. That said, the use of MediaWiki was a major factor in Transcribe Bentham's success. It's an instantly recognisable interface. It integrates various components of the project, and most importantly, it's got very powerful user management and versioning capabilities. Excuse me. In practice, if you volunteer for Transcribe Bentham, you will be presented with this. On the left, plain text transcription box, and on the right, an image viewer. And you're asked to produce a diplomatic transcript of the page. That is everything you see on the page, including text that may have been struck through. We realised that volunteers might not have any experience of XML markup, so the transcription toolbar was developed so that volunteers could either simply highlight a portion of the text or a place in the text, press the button, and the markup is added automatically. Although some volunteers have learned the markup by themselves now and prefer to type it manually rather than using the toolbar. We introduced a second iteration of the Transcription Desk in July 2013, the key innovation being a live preview of how an encoded transcript, so you go from that to that, how it looks when it's saved and rendered, so that it would help the volunteers to better understand how the markup works and thereby reduce any coding errors that they might make. Because when it comes to us checking transcripts, we've found that checking the markup and correcting that takes far longer than it does to actually check the text of the transcript. Since 2018, the platform's been managed by UCL Research Computing, and they've made a number of further improvements to the platform, mostly behind the scenes to make management of the platform more efficient for staff, including the automation of project statistics. The main task on an ongoing basis in Transcribe Bentham, which is currently coordinated by our colleague Dr. Chris Riley, is checking and submitting the transcripts submitted by volunteers. And this process can be seen in the slide there. So in practice, the volunteer selects a page to transcribe and encode and then submits it for checking. The transcript is then checked by us for accuracy, with changes being made to the text and the markup if necessary, with the key consideration being whether any appreciable improvements can be made through further crowdsourcing, and whether the transcript forms a viable basis for both public display and for editorial work. If the transcript is approved, it's locked and converted into an XML file ready for uploading to the repository. If it's judged incomplete, then it remains available for further crowdsourcing and hopefully improvement. And of course, this is a subjective process, but it does ensure that locked transcripts are a reliable guide to the contents of a particular manuscript, and it also encourages volunteers by reassuring them that we are looking at the stuff that they produce and we provide feedback upon their contributions. As of the 30th of October this year, Transcribe Bentham volunteers have transcribed or partially transcribed 25,697 pages of Bentham's papers, which is about 10 million words, we estimate. at an average rate of 47 transcripts per week. And by any measure, this is an enormous amount of work, particularly when you consider that if I dedicated my time to doing nothing but transcription, I might be expected to transcribe maybe 50 to 60 pages a week. There are, as you can see, a number of spikes in the rate of participation. The first coming at the end of 2010, from about late October to mid-December 2010, it looked like Transcribe Bentham might fail. There were some weeks we were only receiving maybe 7 or 8 transcripts per week. On the 28th of December 2010, however, an article about the project appeared in the New York Times, which trebled the user base overnight, and we didn't catch up on checking transcripts for several weeks. In April 2011, an article on citizen science and crowdsourcing appeared in the Sunday Times, which recruited our single most prolific transcriber, and more of that in a moment. So I'm very grateful to Philip for speaking to the journalist that day, because otherwise we may not be quite as successful as we are now. But this media coverage, particularly the New York Times article, gave Transcribe Bentham a momentum and a profile on which we've been able to build and more or less maintain ever since, with certain fluctuations here and there. The biggest spike, as you can see, came in spring 2014, when we made available for the first time Bentham family correspondence material, which is held by the British Library. And from about March 2014, for a year, volunteers were producing an average of over 100 transcripts per week. And that again just drove more publicity to the project. There's been an uptick more recently at the outset of the pandemic, when Atlas Obscura, an online cultural heritage magazine, put together an article of projects which people who were locked down might wish to participate in to pass the time. And since April this year, volunteers have worked on around 1,000 pages alone in that time. However, like any crowdsourcing project, even Wikipedia itself, the majority of the work for Transcribe Bentham has been done by a minority of users. As of the end of last month, 772 registered volunteers had worked on at least one transcript, though around 2/3 of that number had only worked on one, indicating to us that the task is either too difficult or appeared too difficult and complex for many who might otherwise be prepared to get involved. Most of the transcripts have been produced by these 35 super transcribers, as we call them, and the ones in blue are those who participated in the last 12 months. As you can see, 10 of those volunteers, 10 of these super transcribers have worked on over 1,000 transcripts each, including one who has worked on over 5,000 transcripts, which is just remarkable. In other words, those super transcribers comprise about 5% of all registered volunteers who have participated. The super transcribers have worked on 97% of all transcripts, and one user alone has worked on 20% of all transcripts. So in this sense, Transcribe Bentham might not be crowdsourcing at all, at least as it's commonly understood, and might rather be termed crowd-sifting, a term coined by our colleague, Transcribe Bentham colleague, Professor Melissa Terrace, formerly of UCL and now at Edinburgh. That is, you issue the traditional open call associated with crowdsourcing, then you encourage the emergence of a self-selecting smaller group of individuals with the skill, desire and time to regularly participate. And I think the importance of supporting volunteers in a crowdsourcing project cannot be overestimated. They are giving their time and their effort gratis to the project, so the least you can do is to support them. And if just one of our most active participants ceased participating, then the transcription rate would drop rather noticeably. So we have to support our existing super transcribers while at the same time making participation attractive and straightforward enough for newcomers who might themselves become super transcribers. For instance, we ensure that volunteers are properly recognised. So there's a leaderboard on the project. The checking process is a form of feedback, and we credit everybody whose transcripts might be used in the production of a volume of the collected works. So this is an extract from our forthcoming volume of Bentham's writings on Australia. Whenever I've spoken about Transcribe Bentham over the years, you can almost guarantee that two very reasonable questions will come up. The first being, can volunteer transcripts ever be of a high enough standard for forming the basis of scholarly work? And second, would the time and money required to develop the platform, recruit and manage volunteers, and check submissions not just be better off invested in employing someone to transcribe the manuscripts themselves? So from October 2012 to September 2014, Transcribe Bentham was funded by the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation to answer those two major questions. And we measured the quality of submissions in a level of detail never before or since seen in a humanities crowdsourcing project. I won't go into too much detail here, but say for a few headline figures. During that time, we checked and approved 4,363 transcripts, or about 2 million words. We spent about 309 hours, or 41.2 working days, checking those transcripts. The quality of submissions was extraordinary. On average, a transcript needed only 3 changes to its text before we accepted it, and 5 to its markup, and it took an average of 3 minutes and 27 seconds to check and approve each transcript. The new iteration of the Transcription Desk went live halfway through the data gathering process, so we could do a before and after comparison, and it had the effect that we desired, effectively helping volunteers to halve the number of encoding errors they made in each submitted transcript. And this is especially important as it was the transcripts with more than 15 or more errors in the markup that took a disproportionate amount of our time to check, and it just made the checking process much more efficient and reduce these encoding errors. And it's been a long-held ambition of ours to introduce a what you see is what you get transcription interface, so that the markup is entirely hidden from view, and the volunteers can just concentrate on the main task, which is of course transcribing Bentham. Connected to the increased efficiency in the checking process is significant cost avoidance potential. We estimated in September 2014, when there were still around 60,000 pages still to be transcribed, that to employ a researcher to do the job, it would cost around £1 million. But no funding body, of course, would ever hand over that sort of money simply just to fund a transcription project. If instead all the outstanding pages were transcribed by volunteers and checked by Transcribe Bentham staff, the Bentham Project could avoid in the long term costs of over £1 million. Now we do have to take into account against that the total of about £600,000 invested in Transcribe Bentham by the HRC and the Mellon Foundation to develop a platform, begin and complete a major digitisation programme from scratch, and so on. But there will be significant and ongoing cost avoidance, which is especially important as the Bentham Project is reliant upon securing competitive research grants in order to fund our editorial work. So we estimate, for instance, that in editing the volume of Bentham's writings on Australia, having draft transcripts of around 60% of all the manuscripts saved about 6 months of my time, which would have otherwise been spent locating and transcribing the manuscripts. Instead, I could deliver those transcripts to Philip for checking and revision and forming into texts, freeing up my time to do other editorial tasks. And this is, of course, very, very much long-term cost avoidance, but it will far exceed the initial investment in Transcribe Bentham. In addition, thanks to Transcribe Bentham, the day when the entire collection might be fully transcribed may also come sooner than we ever envisaged. Had Transcribe Bentham never existed, we estimate that the earliest that the remainder of the Bentham Papers would have been fully transcribed would be about 2081 at the earliest. However, if volunteers continue at the current rate of transcription, then that landmark could be hit later this decade, which back in 2010 would have been a really unthinkable prospect. I'll briefly, if there's time, just before Christmas 2012, we were invited to take part in a European research consortium applying for funding from the European Research Council to work on develop tools for the indexing, searching and transcription by computers of historic manuscripts using handwritten text recognition, document image analysis and keyword spotting technologies. So this was the Transcriptorium project, which ran from 2013 to 2015, sorry, and the Retrieval and Enrichment of Archival Documents project, or READ, which ran from 2016 to 2019. The key output of these projects was a client called Transcribus, which you can download for free and use these technologies. You can essentially either create your own language model through the platform or use an already available one off the shelf to recognize historic material from any period and automatically transcribe it and analyze it. And it's really a transformative technology in how we access our cultural heritage. And the Bentham Papers were integral to testing the HTR technology to destruction, essentially. By the end of the project, the HTR technology had been developed to such a point it was capable of achieving what is called a character error rate. So that's the say an average Bentham manuscript had a character error rate of 5% at the end of the project. That means the technology recognized 95% of the characters on that page correctly. And our long-term goal, we hope, would be to incorporate this technology into Transcribe Bentham, so users with varying capabilities and varying amounts of disposable free time could ask the HTR engine to provide either a transcript of a page which then they could correct against the manuscript, or if they prefer to transcribe the page themselves, they could request help from the HTR engine. If they couldn't read a particular word or series of words, it could offer solutions. And very briefly, let's see if this live test works. Can I just check? Can you see that, Chris?
Yes, Tim, we can.
Good. So this is a keyword spotting engine produced by our colleagues at the Polytechnic University of Valencia. It contains all of the Bentham Papers at UCL and the British Library. We can search the entire collection based on pattern recognition without having to transcribe all the manuscripts. So, for instance, if I searched for Manchester, the engine will find that the Bentham Papers are arranged into 174 archival boxes and then folios within there. So I'll pick one at random in box 111. And there we are. Manchester has been successfully identified. This is a hugely valuable research tool for us. I was only using it this morning to try and identify a few pages of manuscripts. But it's just another example of how these technologies are really transforming how we do research on historic material with the aid of information technology and computers. And I think I'll stop there. Thank you. I'll cease sharing.
Thank you very much, Tim and Philip. Thank you for a very interesting presentation this evening, giving us lots to think about and quite a lot to explore. So what you haven't said so far is how people can join Transcribe Bentham Project. Where do they go?
Yes, I will. Essentially, if you Google for Transcribe Bentham, you'll be taken to our platform and you can access it there. But I'll put a link somewhere.
And we'll publish it in the description with the video when it goes up. The replay goes up tomorrow as well. Philip, a question for you. What do you think that Jeremy Bentham would make of the modern world? Are his utilitarian philosophies, if he was alive today, do you think he would actually continue down the viewpoint that he's had during his life, or do you think he would look at the modern world in abject horror?
The modern world, in a lot of respects, is Benthamite. The influence Bentham has had is quite extraordinary, really, and not that not that a lot of people would agree with quite a few of his views, but let's think about his basic approach, which is you add up the costs and the benefits of a particular course of action, and you can see a sort of almost a direct line between Bentham and modern economics. And to the extent that we're well, until recently, we're now in a world dominated by medics, but there's also sort of a utilitarian approach to medicine to some extent. But economics is in a sense a discipline par excellence, and it dominates our lives. But Bentham would say, this is how we operate. We operate through a cost-benefit analysis. When we're deciding what to do, we add up the advantages, and we sort of subtract the disadvantages, and we take the best course of action that's in our power. And it's that psychology on which that psychological viewpoint on which Bentham builds his whole system. And so rational, evidence-based approaches are Benthamite. He might not agree with some of the conclusions that people draw, but insofar as the approach is based on evidence, and insofar the aim is to increase human happiness, or not just human happiness, because animals feel pain and pleasure as well, so they have to count in the calculation. But insofar as the action promotes welfare or happiness, then that's the right action to take. So we are in a lot of respects living in a Benthamite world, but that's not to say he would approve of lots of things that take place. He would, I'm sure, object still as strongly as ever to the legal profession. He was skeptical of religion, and insofar as that has an influence on our lives, he would decry that. He would be surprised that there's still a monarchy, and particularly a House of Lords, and will want to push us in a more democratic direction. But a lot of the developments that have taken place since Bentham's time are sort of utilitarian stroke Benthamite.
Interesting.
So he really is a very important philosopher. I know you've got Marx and in between, him and now, but who's winning the battle?
Would Bentham still be considered a political radical now, or would he be seen as more of a conservative thinker?
I think his vision of democracy is probably one of the most radical we have in the literature. He's probably the most radical of any major thinker. In that he would have everyone going to the polls every year, and we would also be able to remove our politicians at any point through a sort of petition and majority votes. I suspect not many of them would last long, would they? And government in our modern democracies is dominated by this notion of a separation of powers. So there's certain power to the legislature, a certain power to the executive, and certain power to the judiciary. Bentham wanted all the power in the legislature because that represented the will of the people. He also wanted open government. So democracy is only the start of the answer to the problems. It's within a democratic structure that you can bring in other what he calls securities against misrule to make sure we're governed well. And I mean, he was writing at the end of the 18th, early 19th century, so his ideas need to be adapted. But there are serious thinkers who are using Bentham's ideas to think about how we might improve the way in which we govern ourselves, and Bentham is very relevant. For instance, in today's world of surveillance, because of the Panopticon Prison. The notion of surveillance is seen to originate with Panopticon, and so people are still studying Bentham's views on surveillance in order to understand, what's the nature of it and what's the relationship between surveillance and liberal stroke totalitarian government. There are lots of areas where Bentham is still relevant. So we have both his historical importance and his contemporary relevance.
Interesting. As general editor of the collected works of Jeremy Bentham, you've obviously seen your project before Transcribe Bentham and after Transcribe Bentham. What, in your opinion, has been the biggest impact of the TB project on your work, your role?
It's given us a much higher profile. Transcribe Bentham is now regarded as one of the classic digital humanities projects. They don't usually last long, so for it to keep going for 10 years is quite extraordinary. And we can see where we, Tim's talked about where we need to go with it as well. And if we had the money, this is always a problem. We could turn it into a generic crowdsourcing platform. And this is what we would like to do next, whereby anyone could upload their documents and ask people to transcribe them. So it would be a web-based platform. Which
becomes the humanities version of the SETI project. In essence, the BOINC project, as it's called for computational work.
Okay. And it's also, as Tim said, saving us time. So the first job we have to do when we're editing is to get a transcript of Bentham's manuscripts, and we have to put a certain amount of time into Transcribe Bentham, but it's the way it's been set up is like a model of crowdsourcing. So we got grants which we would never have got otherwise to set the thing up. So in a sense, it's all a bonus to us. And now we've got it set up and it's up and running. We have these 20,000 pages transcribed by volunteers, which gives us our starting point when we go on to edit Bentham's material. I mean, there's a lot more work has to be done once you get that rough transcript. I mean, it's only the first stage in the process, but it is the first stage, and it's saving us time and money. And I mean, there was a piece of manuscript I wanted to see for my own scholarly purposes. It had been done by Transcribe Bentham volunteers, so instead of me having to start from scratch, I was able to get the volunteers transcript and work with that. And so I had a readable text within a couple of days, whereas it would have taken me it would have taken me twice as long.
The time-saving benefits are definitely there.
Yeah,
Tim,
and also, sorry, just one more point. Because we're uploading them to a repository, other scholars can then have access to them, and so they wouldn't. They will get a very good idea of what's in that material. I mean, if a scholar was going to use that material, they would have to go and take that transcript and transcribe it themselves. But without that transcript, they wouldn't know what was there.
It's interesting. Tim, you mentioned you've been looking into artificial intelligence. Are there actually any ongoing activity in developing the AI implementation, the neural network implementations at this point?
The Transcribus client, that's now being, even though the grant funding is finished, that's being supported by what they call the Read Co-op, so basically a cooperative society with subscribers ranging from individual scholars to the British Library and so on. So they're constantly working on the HTR technology.
And that's feeding back actively into the code base of Transcribe Bentham.
Not into Transcribe Bentham yet. I mean, again, I think that's one of the limitations of MediaWiki. I mean, as part of the project, we had hoped that we'd be able to integrate Transcribe Bentham or HTR with Transcribe Bentham in some form, but it didn't quite work out. But in the future, I mean, it would be an absolute godsend if we could get it in, because it would make participation so much easier for volunteers. Or there's different options you could do: the full transcription option, the text correction option, asking for help from the machine. And we did some testing with a prototype about 4 years ago, and the results from that were quite promising in terms of speeding things up for the user and the staff checking the transcript.
Yes. Given the historical importance nationally and internationally of Jeremy Bentham, are there any activities at the moment to use the platform to transcribe into non-English languages to make the data available to different regions and dialects?
There was a French version of Transcribe Bentham run by our colleague Emmanuel Deschamps, but that sort of suffered from a lack of investment.
There was a problem with MediaWiki, wasn't there?
Yeah, it wouldn't talk to various aspects of what they needed to do. The Bentham Papers as well, it's mostly in English, but as Philip said, he wrote a considerable amount in French. There's bits in Greek and Latin. Whereas the HTR engine essentially appears to be able to do any kind of script now, as long as you train it sufficiently enough to recognise what you're working with.
Great. And just very quickly, because we are almost out of time here, what would you say the greatest set of challenges you've had to overcome have been with the Transcribe Bentham project?
I'll let you go for that.
All right. Funding. Well, I mean, once we got it set up, it's keeping it going. It's just keeping it going, and it's we've been very lucky with the series of grants. They've now run out, and it's we're now looking for the next big grant to do the next improvement, or just a small amount of money just to keep it ticking over. That's the challenge. We worked hard to get volunteers, and we didn't know what was going to happen. So that looked like a challenge, but that's one we I suppose that was would anybody respond to this? And so because the work's so difficult, and but we found out our super transcribers, so it was a difficult challenge, but we met that, and we've met the challenge to keep it going, but it gets increasingly difficult.
That's wonderful. Well, thank you very much, gentlemen. It's been thoroughly insightful talk, both from the historic and the technical perspective. If anybody in the audience is interested in learning more about the Transcribe Bentham Project, the UCL Bentham Project in general. We will post links in the YouTube replay chat video and make them available on the BCS Hertfordshire website. So, once again, thank you both gentlemen very much for your time this evening. As for our presentation this evening, this is almost at an end, but there is just time for me to remind you that our next event is going to be on Monday the 23rd of November, and we are very honoured to have Elizabeth Braw speaking with us. Elizabeth is you may know, a columnist with Newsweek, and she's also written for Politico, The Times, as well as the Wall Street Journal, beg your pardon. Elizabeth has just, within the last few weeks, finished a tenure at the Royal United Services Institute and has moved to the very prestigious American Enterprise Institute in Washington, D.C. Elizabeth will be talking about cybersecurity and the impact of extranational state powers in a presentation called Why Today's Geopolitical Confrontation Affects Everybody. More information will be posted tomorrow on hearts.bcs.org, our main website. And for me, Chris Tilley, I wish you a very good evening.